was a guy named Matt, and he lived in a high-rise condo building. And one morning, the fire alarm went off. It was quite early in the morning, so he jumped out of bed, threw on whatever he could find, and ran out of the building, just as one would if there was a fire in your building. He got outside and, talking to his neighbors, realized it was a false alarm. There was no fire in the building, but he was up. So he said, well, while I'm up, I might as well walk around the corner and go get a cup of coffee. Now, if you remember, it's early. He just threw some clothes on. He turned the corner, and there was a 9-year-old boy there. And he saw Matt, and he said, this is someone who needs help. And this 9-year-old had just received some money from his parents because he had made good grades. And he thought, this guy needs the money more than I need the money. So he walked up to Matt, and he said, I'd really like to help you out, and handed him a $1 bill. Obviously, Matt did not look like he normally looked. And so he later, on reporting the story, said it had been a long time since someone had showed him kindness like that. Since someone had gone out of their way to try and help him out. Thinking he was homeless, he wasn't, but didn't hold the 9-year-old back. And he went on to report that you don't know where it's going to come from, where someone is going to offer you that goodness or that kind of kindness. But if we have eyes to see, we might even find our own opportunities to care for others like that. I want to welcome you to Crosspoint this morning. If you have your Bible, I want to go ahead and encourage you to turn it to Ruth chapter 2. It's in your Old Testament. It might take you a minute to find it. It's a short book. I trust that you'll be able to find it, though. Today we'll be in chapter 2. Last week we were in Ruth chapter 1, and we started this study on the book of Ruth. And, Ruth can be about a number of things, but it is, first and foremost, we're going to talk about it in terms of loyalty and faithfulness. Because just like we learned last week, Ruth was loyal to Naomi. She was faithful to her. She was faithful to her commitment when she had left her family's home for her husband. And even though she is a widow now, she stuck to that commitment and stuck with Naomi. Even when there were no good answers, no good plans, because here is Naomi, a widow herself, and she cannot care for her. But we see in the story that it's not just that it's Ruth that is loyal and faithful, but ultimately it will be God who will be loyal and faithful. One of the things that you have to ask yourself, or you should ask yourself, is why do we have the books we have in our scriptures? Why do we have the book of Ruth? Why is it a story that's been handed down from generations? Why did it impact the people of Israel long ago? And why does it continue to impact us today? And that's something we're going to be talking about this week and over the next couple weeks is what is it about Ruth that God wanted you to know? That God wanted you to hear this story. And so we're going to get some of that today. If you'll remember in Ruth chapter 1, the family leaves Judah, they leave Bethlehem because there is a famine in the land. But Naomi hears that the land is starting to produce again. And so at the end of chapter 1, they return and barley harvest is starting to occur. And that's where we'll pick up the story in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. I told you last week, and I still believe it today, is that a lot of the details that we get are very intentional in the book of Ruth. The writer, the narrator, is telling you something for a reason. For instance, the names are really important. We talked about that last week as well. Here, Boaz means strength. And so again, if you put yourself with the ears of the person who might have first heard this story, this is how they would have heard it. Someone who is strong. That's who Boaz is. It also, he gives them the writer gives this distinction. Now, we read a man of standing in my version, but it could also be a man of worth. And this could mean a couple of things. One, it's that he is a landowner who has substantial means. That is going to be true, and our story is going to talk about that. But it's also, this word is the same word that is used in Proverbs 31 to describe that woman, a worthy woman. Well, now it's the same term that is given to Boaz. He is a worthy man, a man of standing with substantial means, but ultimately he is worthy. And so as you read this, try to understand that that's where it is coming from. Now also what we should point out in verse 2 here is the narrator says, Ruth the Moabite. We know, we just read chapter 1, we know she's from Moab. You don't have to keep telling us that. And yet, the writer is going to continue to do so. They will not let you forget where Ruth is from. And that is for a very specific reason. She isn't in. She's not from Judah. She's not one of God's people. Don't forget that. That's who she is. And with our modern ears, you might read a story like this and you go, what is going on here? Because there are lots of ways that people try to get money who might be what we might use a term like destitute, people who don't have anything. There are lots of ways in our world that people go about getting means, whether it's food or money or things like that, but not this way. Can you imagine if somebody said, you know what, I'm going to go into somebody else's field, I'm going to go get some food. I mean, if I invited, I'm not a landowner in this sense of the word, but I would invite anybody over to my backyard and you can pick some Bermuda and do with it what you will. In fact, if you'll come over almost every week, then, I won't have to mow my yard. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense to us here. You might ask yourself, what is happening? Well, this is a common biblical practice, is to allow others into your field, into the harvest, in order to provide for them. In fact, it comes from the Torah in Leviticus chapter 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. That's just the things that fall off as you are trying to harvest. Don't go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So gleaning here is a way of supporting those who cannot support themselves. It's a way of leaving behind those leftovers that we might think about. That after you pass through once, you do not pass through again to pick up the extra. You leave it behind for the foreigner, the poor, the orphan, the widow, of which Ruth is two of those. We leave that behind for somebody else. Ruth is seeking out this means of survival in a way that she can. Well, one of the things that we see here from the beginning is that God cares how we care for other people. Loving others matters to God. From the very beginning, he said, you do this to support those in your number that you don't put yourself in the same category as. The poor, the foreigner, the outsider. And God in the rest of the law will start to talk about because you were once the outsider. You were the foreigner. Remember your story when no one was caring for you, in fact, enslaved you. If you remember from last week, the Moabites you're not supposed to be friendly with the Moabites because when the Israelites left Egypt, the Moabites did not care for them. That's why God says don't have anything to do with them. God has always cared about how we show love to the marginalized. This is why, church, our rhetoric and our attitudes matter. When you talk about people who don't fit the same category as you, when you talk about them as if they are below you, it matters. When your attitude towards others who don't look like you, who are not from the same place as you, who might root different than you do, vote different than you do, it matters. We're all being shaped. So if your attitude is going to be like that, if your rhetoric is going to be like that, eventually your actions will follow. And from the very beginning, God cared about how we cared about other people. It matters to God that we love and show love to other people. But this teaching doesn't really make sense for us. And so I was thinking this week, what does it mean to glean in our day and age? What does it mean to allow that for other people? Because as I said, my backyard holds nothing of value for anyone. So what does it mean for me? But I was thinking about this teaching. I was thinking about a field. And how, in our day and age, we would say, how much can we get out of what we produce? How can we increase our margins as much as possible? But here what you see is that God doesn't give a direct law as far as He doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. He gives you a heart posture. Allow people to come in on the margins. So again, if you're like the average person today, we would say whatever is mine, and I'm going to live right up into those limits. In fact, you might actually go grab some credit, a loan or a credit card. You might even go beyond that. Now, I'm not looking down on credit card usage or anything like that, but what the teaching we have here is God says, don't live all the way up to the limit. Cut back a little bit. Build into your life the care for other people. And you know, in their day and age, people would have been able to see that. Imagine if your field is producing something, but your neighbor, you're like, what are you doing? You're leaving a lot unharvested here. Why would you not have your servants, your employees go back through and pick up the extra? Why would you not do that? After all, there was just a famine in the land. It's because God is teaching them another way. And I think this is one of the teachings, this is why Scripture is so valuable to us, is that we have to learn to live in a way that we can care for other people. We don't live right up to the edge of our limits. We take a step back. This can be in terms of your finances, yes, and you might need to start there for many of us. But you can think about this in other ways as well. Rather than filling your schedule to the brim with your things, rather than filling your finances to the brim with your things, how do you take a step back? What are areas of your life that you could make room for others? Because as God said, leave them for the poor and the foreigner. How can you make space in your life to show love to other people? We want to live within our means so that we can love others just like we've been loved. A great example of this happens on our property all the time. You may not realize this, but there is a garden on our property on the corner right over here between us and LA Fitness. Last year, it won an award for the most food donated to food banks and local neighbors in the DFW area. That garden donated over 3,000 pounds of food last year. And it's something that we can be proud of, church. That we can see that is a way that we use what God has given us here to bless other people. In other places, and with other ideas, we might say that's our property. Let's use it for how we want to use it. But it goes strictly for the blessing of others. How can you do that in your own life? Because loving others matters to God. The story continues in verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came to the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Again, the story will not let you forget who Ruth is and where she is from. So Boaz answers Ruth, and he says to her, "Because I have heard about your loyalty to Naomi. I have heard about how you have cared for Naomi." And Boaz wants to repay that kindness. Because she was loyal, he will be too. So after this, Boaz invites Ruth to his table. He feeds her. And he's starting to include her in the community. Because even Ruth here doesn't see herself as one of the community. She knows that she should not expect that. She is the foreigner. And yet she has clung to Naomi. She has adopted Naomi's family as her own. But did you notice how Boaz referred to her? Who does she belong to? He wants to know whose wife it is, whose daughter it is, whose servant she is, because that person's name is more important than her own. The absence of Ruth's name, coupled with how they talk about it, is serving to further this idea that she is the foreigner. She is not included in this. She's an outsider. The text reads as if it's happenstance, as if it's just a awesome accident that she stumbles upon Boaz's field. But careful readers of the story would realize that God is at work in this story. That God's fingerprints have been all over this, being loyal and faithful to Naomi. First by providing Ruth, and now for leading Ruth to Boaz's field. God is loyal and faithful. Ruth is going to learn in just a minute that Boaz is a possible redeemer, that he is one who is close to the family. He could redeem their land, but he can also redeem Naomi and Ruth and provide means for them. He's starting to show this as the protector by saying, "Stay with my land. Stay with my women, and I'll make sure that nobody harms you." Why does he have to make sure nobody harms her? Why is this a reality? Well, because in their day and age, who cares if the foreigner goes missing? Who cares if she's no longer there? She's a nobody. Who cares if she's abused or neglected or hurt in any way? Nobody, except for Boaz. Boaz is starting to establish himself as the guardian, the protector, the redeemer. We see that he is starting to show honor to her because of how she has treated Naomi. And so what we see here is that it's not about how you treat, it is about how you treat others, not where you're from, that matters. From the very beginning, God cared that we would care about, that we would love other people. It's not about where we're from, it's about how we treat people. That's what matters. What we start to see in this story is that there are two people that will be called worthy. One is Ruth, and one is Boaz. Both because of how they treat other people. So Ruth is going to be fed and cared for. Not because of anything she did, not because of where she's from, but because she showed faithfulness to Naomi, because Boaz is going to respond in kind. Now, I grew up in Oklahoma City, but my mom grew up on a farm. And there are still people to this day that when it comes time for harvest, everything else stops, and this is what matters. And so I can remember growing up hearing stories of my grandma getting out there to help with the harvest, and aunts and cousins, and anybody that is able, get out there. And this is one of the reasons why farmers are some of the most faithful people that you can know. Because all year, or at least all season, they're looking forward to this one moment that will care for them, that will provide for the rest of the year. And all it takes is one thunderstorm, one high wind, one tornado, and it's all gone. So it leads you to being a a faithful person, relying not on what you've done, but on God to provide. And you can have a moment like this where they allow people like Naomi and Ruth to come behind them during the harvest, during these times. And for that day, Ruth and Naomi would be cared for. For that day, they would have their daily bread. Now, the barley season lasted about 7 weeks in ancient Israel. For 7 weeks, they had a plan. But then what? There is no plan after this. And this is why Boaz will be so important. Because he is opening up the community to include Ruth. Ruth has pledged her life to Naomi, but it doesn't mean that it's going to go any further than that. But Boaz invites her to his table. He protects her on his property. He's starting to open up the community to one even like her. So in the story, Ruth goes home, and Boaz has provided her with even more food. He's told his employees, give her more than what she finds. And so she comes home arms full, not for just that day, but for multiple days she has been provided for. And so in verse 19, we read this. Naomi asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. The name of the man I work today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and to the dead. She added, that man is a close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all of my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth comes home, and to show, look what my day produced. And her announcement provokes a response that she did not anticipate seeing. And what we have here is the turning point in the book of Ruth. Theologically and rhetorically, something is changing here because Naomi sees that something is happening. The story started with hunger. They had to flee their land because they were hungry, but now there is an abundance of food. What Ruth perceives as favor, that word is mentioned 2 times. Naomi understands differently. You didn't just happen upon Boaz. It's not because you've been favored for any reason, but because we see the work of God here. Because God is loyal and he is providing for Naomi. He is redeeming her story. Her life is changing because of this. God is ultimately the one who is at work here. What we see here is that God is loyal and faithful. And we are his hands and feet. In this story, all of Judah experienced a famine. And then they are starting to be blessed. That God is starting to produce again on their land. And it's not just that because God has been at work that Ruth and Naomi are taken care of. God is using Boaz to make that happen. And God still works that way. That he uses you and I to bless other people. We are called to be about his work. In fact, you can see here that Boaz is doing exactly what he was called to do, to care for the least of these in his community, to care for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, to live just as what James calls pure religion, true religion. Boaz is living that way. What strikes me in this story is that there was a famine in the land, and that would have even impacted Boaz. That it wasn't that long ago that he could not provide for anyone, much less others. But he hasn't let that hold him back. That ultimately God cares, is calling us to care about those in our community who cannot care for themselves. It's not about where you're from or what your last name is. It's about how you treat people. Ultimately, God is going to be at work, and He's going to use you to do it. He's going to use your hands and your feet. There was a man named Jim, and he was living his dream in many senses of the word. He'd wanted to be a journalist, and he had achieved that. He was getting to cover what he wanted to cover. He was married to the love of his life, and they had 2 kids, 1 boy and 1 girl, the American dream. I have 3 sons. And so his life was pretty much complete. And his kids were involved in sports, and his son played soccer. And there was one boy who played soccer with him that he was always just kind of around. They knew him as he grew up, and they wanted to help him, from afar. This boy had lost one parent at the age of 3 and another at 9 years old. And from that point on, he bounced between different family members' houses, and it was a very difficult life. But he had a friend that he played soccer with, that he would occasionally just be in their orbit, blessed by them. When finally, their son, Jim's son, came to him and said, I think we need to invite him to live in our house. And so the boy moved in. And less than a year later, they adopted him. And Jim wrote, he's a journalist, so he wrote, this is the most meaningful experience of my life. If I did nothing else, this would be the moment that I would look back on. Not a moment I was looking for, not the easiest moment, but it was the most meaningful thing we ever did. Saw a need in their community, and they gave of themselves sacrificially for another. Imagine this story from the little boy's point of view, of having no security, no stability, not knowing where you would live or where your meal would come from. Who would care about you? And this other family steps in. See, from the very beginning, it has mattered to God how we care for other people. Not based on where they're from, not based on who they are, but based on how we have been blessed. Boaz is the type of person who has been blessed. And so now he's looking to bless other people. And as I look around this room today, I can see that we have many Boazes in this room. People who have been blessed, yes, with physical resources, but also you have been blessed spiritually. Because many of you have found redemption through Jesus Christ. That you have been blessed. And so we pivot and we start to see who can we bless like we've been blessed. That we don't design a life that just soaks up every bit of what we have, but we say, how can I use what God has given me to bless other people in our life? As we close today, our shepherds and their wives are going to be around the room. And just like every week, I want to invite you to pray with them. And some of you in this room today, I would say that you are a Boaz. And there are people in your life that God is calling you to bless, to give of yourself, maybe in radical ways, to sacrifice from what you have for another person. But maybe you don't know who that person is. Maybe you have never thought in those terms before today, and I want to invite you to pray. To be the kind of person that says, God, give me your eyes to see those people in my life that you are calling me to give to, that you are calling me to live for. There are others here today that I know are more like Ruth, and that you have needs. You have spiritual needs, you have physical needs, and that's what the community of faith is for. And so for you also, I would invite you to go see one of our shepherding couples. So we are here to support and encourage and lift up other people. If we can help you in any way, once you come, always stand and sing.